Good morning from Montana. I'm Stu Wilson. I'm very happy to be here for another edition of Fitz Bits. Thanks to the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library for putting these on. Today I'm talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald's visit to Montana and inspirations for the diamond as big as the Ritz, and have some overview of what that means in terms of the inspirations in the story. And then also want to highlight mainly what I think is a new inspiration, relatively new inspiration for the story. So let's get started. Share my screen here. So I've titled this Gatsby or Cowpoke, Scott's Visit to Montana and Inspirations for the Diamond as Big as the Ritz. One of the reasons I use that title is I think the story of Fitzgerald's visit to Montana stands out for him. We tend to think of Fitzgerald as being Gatsby-esque, suave, urban, and the whole idea of him in a cowboy outfit and visiting the West really stands out for Fitzgerald. Seems counter to his stereotype, unlike for some of his contemporaries, notably Hemingway, who loved the West. Fitzgerald's one visit to the West was his trip to Montana. Fitzgerald's works are always works of imagination, but for so many of his stories, he also used real events and real places. And I think that's particularly true for The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. It really was a strong inspiration for this amazing story. So let's talk a little bit about The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. I certainly hope you have read it or encourage you to reread it. It is a great story. I just wanted to highlight some of the major features of the story, and particularly those that I think have inspiration set in Montana in his visit here. So the story was originally published in the Smart Set magazine in 1922. It was republished shortly thereafter in a short story collection, Tales of the Jazz Age. It is considered by many as one of his most unusual and best short stories. It really is a fantastic allegorical story and stands out in many ways for that. It has been retold by many artists since. It's a well-known story, as well as the title being often used. Orson Welles and Mickey Mouse both have versions of The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. So some of the features of the story is it really is a fantastical and allegorical story of and a critique of uncontrolled wealth, and to some degree, wealth intertwined with religion. And so it's not a straight line story, it really is an allegory. The story centers around the main character, John Unger, who visits his college friend's home in the West. College friend is Percy Washington. And Percy's father, Braddock T. Washington, has a mountain made of diamond. It's unbelievable wealth, beyond anything that anyone can imagine. And it's totally isolated. The ways to get there are really, really remote and difficult. At this enclave of the Washington, slavery still exists, and there's strong Confederate connections to Braddock Washington. And so that's one of the fantastical aspects of the story. The outside world then is a threat, particularly airplanes who can discover this enclave. And another major feature of the story are two beautiful daughters, sisters of Percy, Jasmine and Kissman. And so those are some of the major features that I think we'll touch on as we look at Montana inspirations. Being trained as a historian, I also like to think about the historical context. Fitzgerald visited Montana in 1915 and then wrote the story in 1922. And when you think about our recent social upheavals, pales in comparison to what happened in the 7 years from between Fitzgerald's visit to Montana and his writing of the story. World War I, massive labor unrest. The largest labor unrest in St. Paul was in 1917. Also in that period was major IWW Wobblies action in Montana. So major labor unrest, Russian Revolution, women's suffrage, prohibition, major technology coming online. And so the whole idea that the old world order is gone and there's this new lost generation. So behind Fitzgerald's allegory are a lot of these themes around uncontrolled wealth and even critiques of religion. And how does one make one's way in this new world? So let's look at what we actually know about Scott's summer in Montana. We don't know a whole lot, but we do know some things. He visited Montana with his friend Charles Sape Donohoe in July 1915. Fitzgerald, the one picture of Fitzgerald from his Montana visit is on the left, and Charles Sape Donohoe is on the right. And then in the middle is Fitzgerald on the Newman football team. Newman was the prep school, Catholic prep school that both he and Sape attended. And then they both went to Princeton together. And so the visit was after their freshman year at Princeton. Fitzgerald was 18 going on 19 when he visited. The Sape, by the way, it's not sap, comes from Donohoe's nickname was Homo sapiens. And so that was shortened to Sape. So Charles Sape Donohoe. This is a map of 1910 from Montana to highlight where they were coming. The star is White Sulphur Springs, the town that they came to. Helena is about an hour as the crow flies to the west. North is Fort Benton. Fort Benton was the last fort in the Missouri, and this is where anyone traveling up the Missouri River, the last stop on the Missouri, and that will play in here a little bit later on in the story. The large oval, red oval to the west, to the left, is Butte and Anaconda, and this is the location of the large copper mine there, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the future in a minute as well. So here's a more detailed map of the area. White Sulphur Springs is in a large valley, and Helena, as I said, as the crow flies, is about an hour to the west. In between are the Big Belt Mountains. Mount Edith is part of those, and that's a quite rough, rugged, still today, mountain range. So White Sulphur Springs, the town that Fitzgerald visited, was about 1,800 people at the time, and it's still about the same size. He visited White Sulphur Springs with the Donohoes, and the Donohoes had a nearby ranch, the Castle Mountain Livestock Company. It was about half beef and half sheep at the time, very large ranch. But they also owned the large house, the Stone Castle, which is now a museum in White Sulphur Springs. This is the largest house in White Sulphur Springs, set on top of a hill. It's a fairly modest house by St. Paul standards. I would guess it's probably a sixth the size of the James J. Hill House in St. Paul, for instance. Fitzgerald lived in houses that were of comparable size. But the whole idea that this stone castle dominated the town was pretty amazing. Sape's father, Charles's father, Michael, was the vice president and oversaw the finances of the Anaconda mine in Butte. And they had lived in Butte for a while, and then Michael had bought property in White Sulphur Springs and had lived here for a while. At the time of Fitzgerald's visit, the Donohoes actually lived in Seattle, and they had moved there a few years before, but they usually came back and spent time in Montana during the summer. This is what we know from Fitzgerald's ledger about his visit in July 1915. And again, we believe his ledger was started in 1919, 1920. So this is him remembering his visit to Montana and White Sulphur Springs. So I'll highlight a few of the things in the ledger here. Dick Collins was the foreman of the ranch. Sport and Son of a Bitch were two of the horses on the ranch. And we don't know if the horses that he rode are just famous horses on the ranch. Aubrey and Olga Black were the two town beauties in White Sulphur Springs. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but many people believe they were the inspiration for the two daughters, sisters in Diamond as Big as the Ritz. Her fatal love, don't know for sure. That might be a reference to Ginevra King. Prior to coming out, the month before he came out to Montana, Fitzgerald had his first major love, Ginevra King, had met with Ginevra at the Ritz in New York City, and then stopped in Lake Forest, Illinois to see Ginevra on his way out to Montana. So that may be a reference to Ginevra, we're not exactly sure. The Deutzers, again, haven't really been able to confirm this, but the original owners of the Castle Mountain Ranch were the Dancers. And so this may be one of Fitzgerald's famous misspellings of the original owners of the ranch. Butte's payroll probably refers, and they did stop at Butte after they left White Sulphur Springs, probably refers to Michael Donohoe having to stop in Butte to deal with the finances for the Anaconda mine. The other specific reference that Fitzgerald made was in his short autobiography in Alcohol and Drinks, referencing raw whiskey and getting up on a table and singing to the cowmen. To the left is a view near Castle Mountain Ranch today, and a few other views of the ranch territory today. It truly is big sky country, very open ranch territory. Again, the population is about the same as it was when Fitzgerald visited. And it's still a working ranch today, although it's only beef, no sheep. Of the space and where he was visiting. So now I want to talk to some of the Montana inspirations for Diamond as Big as the Ritz. And other scholars have done work on this previously, and I want to highlight some of those. There are also some obvious ones, and then I want to spend some time on an inspiration which I think is really primary, and I happened upon a few years ago in my first visit to White Sulphur Springs. So some of the obvious inspirations are the Black family sisters, Olga and Aubrey, as being models for Jasmine and Kissman. Just seems to resonate as there being these two sisters who would be the models for the story. Obviously, the connection to the wealth of the Donohoes and the wealth that's displayed in Diamond as Big as the Ritz seem to be a connection. And then the very obvious one is the visit to a college friend's Western ranch is exactly what happened with Fitzgerald and happens in the story. So one of the best articles on White Sulphur Springs visit by Fitzgerald is by Landon Jones. I highly recommend the article. Some of the themes that he highlights as being inspirations for Diamond as Big as the Ritz are how isolated and remote it is. It's difficult to find and visit. Montana is an extremely large state, and White Sulphur Springs still is very much off the beaten track. You have to really want to get to White Sulphur Springs to get there. It's not on any major routes or anything. So it is difficult to find, and that's certainly an aspect of Diamond as Big as the Ritz. Again, the stone castle house is inspiration for luxury. The fact that this stands out so strongly in White Sulphur Springs clearly could have fed into Fitzgerald's inspiration. And then an aspect that Jones turned up is there are crystal caves on the ranch property. I don't have any pictures of those, but the whole idea of crystal and diamonds, it's likely that Fitzgerald would have visited those caves in the weeks that he stayed at the ranch. And that may have been an inspiration for the whole idea of diamonds as well. There are a couple of other views of the stone castle house. It's now a museum run by the local historical society. Again, very prominent in the town. Certainly Fitzgerald had experienced wealth way beyond this, but its standing in the town is pretty impressive. Also, another scholar who's done some good work, who's a native Montanan, is Ross Tangadal. Ross has pointed out the connections to Butte and the Anaconda mine, copper mine, and Michael Donohoe being the vice president there. The Anaconda was one of the wealthiest mines in US history. Much of the copper that wired the United States came out of the Anaconda. Incidentally, much of that copper was shipped east on James J. Hill's, Fitzgerald's neighbor, Great Northern line. The Great Northern was known for being able to carry a lot of freight. And so another Minnesota-Montana connections. And again, this was often called as the richest hill on earth. So the whole idea of the Anaconda mine certainly could have played into this excessive capitalism. The Anaconda, as you see in this cartoon of the period, really controlled much of Montana. It was so wealthy. Butte at the time was the largest city between Chicago and San Francisco. So let's talk about the inspiration that I think really may have played into Fitzgerald's imagination and what I came upon on my first visit to White Sulphur Springs. I was looking at a map, and nearby, not too far away from White Sulphur Springs, was a little town called Diamond City, which turned out to be a ghost town, but appeared on this map. And immediately my interest was piqued in terms of the diamond name, because where did Fitzgerald get the whole idea of a diamond? And so looked into it a little bit more and to see if there was more of a connection. And yes, indeed, I think there is a strong connection between the story and Diamond City, which again is now a ghost town. So let's talk about that a little bit. I went the wrong way. So Diamond City is in the middle of the Big Belt Mountains, halfway between Helena and White Sulphur Springs. Fort Logan would be the old fort, Army fort in the area. There was a trail that went from White Sulphur Springs to Diamond City. So there was a path, a road. There still is a very rough road that can get you between Diamond City and Fort Logan. As you can see here, this is all very remote territory. And the going on the major highways, it would take you about an hour and a half, 2 hours to get from White Sulphur Springs to Diamond City. But there is a more direct route that certainly existed in Fitzgerald when Fitzgerald visited. So Diamond City was set in, talk a little bit about what Diamond City was. It was set in a gulch, really steep stream bed called Confederate Gulch. This is all from a very well-documented book by Kelly Flynn. Diamond City and Confederate Gulch were founded in 1864 by 4 men. Interestingly, 3 of them were Confederate soldiers. They had all been captured in Missouri and by Union forces, and they were given the choice of either being in a Union prison or getting on a boat to go up the Missouri up to Fort Benton. And so as you might expect, they all hopped on the boat and went up the Missouri and got out of the Union hair. They made their way down in this rough wilderness down into the Big Belt Mountains and discovered gold in Confederate Gulch. And Diamond City was born in 1864. The name comes from, there was an enormous big rock in the center of Diamond City. And in the first winter after they had discovered gold, the 4 men built cabins on the 4 corners of the rock. And during the winter, they would walk between the 4 cabins and it created a diamond. And so the 4 men named it Diamond City from the pattern that was created in the snow around this big rock. The founder was considered to be Washington Baker, one of the 3 Confederate soldiers, as the person who really initially discovered it, along with his 3 friends. This was a huge gold strike, one of the largest gold strikes in Montana history, and there were some big gold strikes in Montana history. The height of the gold rush there was between 1867 and 1870. The population soared in this time period. And the city continued for a number of decades afterwards, but obviously in decline after the big gold rush. Interestingly, as the city began to decline, many of the residents there moved to White Sulphur Springs and founded White Sulphur Springs. There is a hot springs in White Sulphur Springs. So they moved there thinking that their next fortune would be in developing the springs. Little was left at Diamond City by 1915, and no buildings remain today. I'll show you some pictures here of the history of Diamond City and Confederate Gulch. So here's the place at its height of the gold rush. The gold mining was basically blasting water into the walls of the gulch and then extracting the gold as it came down. So extreme environmental degradation by today's standards. But you can see it was quite a substantial place from all the huts by 1867. Here's a little bit later view, and you can begin to see how much of the mining had already taken away parts of the gulch. Here is a later view, a couple decades later. The place is still, obviously quite rustic, but still a good population as we about 1890. In the 1920s, the time period when Fitzgerald, if he did visit, there still were some houses and a few residents in Diamond City. The last original cabin on the bottom right here was torn down sometime in the 1960s. So there truly is it's not even a ghost town. There are no buildings left on the site currently. And here's some pictures going up Confederate Gulch. It is a very narrow gulch stream bed. Very, very isolated, really wilderness today, and would have been very difficult and isolated to get to even in Fitzgerald's time. And today, really on the site of Diamond City are basically just slag heaps where they blew apart the hillsides and to extract the gold. So let's talk a little bit and review what the inspirations of Diamond City and Confederate Gulch, how they may have inspired Fitzgerald's story. It is a compelling story in itself, Diamond City, the whole ghost town, and it's one that Scott is likely to have heard. Many of the residents, as I said, later moved to White Sulphur Springs. The two were intimately connected. One of the founders of White Sulphur Springs, Dr. Parberry, house was very prominent, and I'll show you that in a minute. So there is this connection. I haven't discovered any definitive evidence that Fitzgerald knew of Diamond City, but it was in the ether in White Sulphur Springs. Having reviewed some of the papers of the time on a monthly basis, former residents of Diamond City were beginning to pass away, and their obituaries were in the local paper, and they would recount their story of being in Diamond City. So it's a story, again, that Scott is likely to have heard. It's not impossible. It would have been fairly easy for Scott and the Donohoes also to make a trip over to Diamond City, which they may have done. No evidence of that. The Diamond name is very compelling in and of itself to inspire Fitzgerald. And then the fact that there was this big rock at the center of the city in some ways parallels the whole notion of a diamond mountain. Further inspirations, here you can see a little bit more detail of the area. There also was another gold strike along Confederate Gulch called El Dorado. So the whole idea of this being one of the richest gold strikes in an extremely isolated area, both El Dorado and Diamond City may have fired Fitzgerald's imagination. And again, the founder of Diamond City was Washington Baker, one of the major characters, the patriarch of the story. And Diamond, as big as the Ritz, was Braddock Washington, so Washington Baker, Braddock Washington. And then there's a strong Confederate connection in both the story and the real life Diamond City. Again, extremely isolated. White Sulphur Springs, for being isolated, is not anywhere near as isolated as Confederate Gulch in the middle of the Big Belt Mountains. So there are two other storylines here that are in some ways tangential to Fitzgerald, at the same time very fascinating in terms of both Fitzgerald and St. Paul connections. to Montana, and I wanted to share those with you. I think more research needs to be done to see if there actually is a direct connection or what the direct connection would be. But at least today, there are fascinating sort of 6 degrees of separation that emerged out of doing more research into Montana and Diamond as Big as the Ritz connections. So you may have seen on the maps I showed you before, there's this little town of Ringling, and that in fact is named after the circus brothers, the Ringling brothers. Ringling was a very small town, still is a very small town, really was created as a railroad junction. The Northern Pacific line ran through Ringling, and the Ringlings, John Ringling had actually bought property in White Sulphur Springs, and his intention was to develop White Sulphur Springs as the western base headquarters for the circus. The Ringling brothers were based out of Baraboo, Wisconsin, and had developed and were developing a southern base in Sarasota, Florida. And so John's idea was to create a western base for the famous circus as well. As part of that, the Ringlings actually paid for the railroad spur from Ringling, the Northern Pacific line, up to White Sulphur Springs. And here you can see one of the original certificates from the White Sulphur Springs and Yellowstone Railroad, which the Ringlings actually created and paid for. Sadly, it was torn up in the 1970s, so the rail spur no longer exists. There were strong connections between the Ringlings and St. Paul as well. John Ringling in particular knew Louis Hill, James J. Hill, railroad baron's son. They both participated in a famous car race between St. Paul and Glacier National Park. And so there's this St. Paul connection between the Ringlings and particularly the Hills. So the Ringlings, John Ringling originally had a house in White Sulphur Springs that actually was the house of Dr. William Parberry, one of the founders, who of course, as I noted earlier, came from Diamond City. So the second largest, I think it's probably the second largest house in White Sulphur Springs, was the Ringling house and the old Parberry house. As time developed, we don't know if Fitzgerald met with John Ringling or had any connections there, although it's not likely the small social circle of elites that Fitzgerald would have visited the Parberry house. John Ringling turned over pretty much all of the property at White Sulphur Springs, as the western base of the circus never really developed, to his nephew Richard, who you see here. Again, another 6 degrees of separation. Richard then actually married Aubrey Black, who was probably one of the inspirations for the 2 daughters in Diamond as Big as the Ritz. There's more of this story to tell, but I think it's a fascinating connection, intertwining connection in and of itself. But the connections go further. John Ringling in around 1910 had invited out to White Sulphur Springs, Lewis and Scott. And this would have been before Fitzgerald's visit. Lewis Scott was the head of the opera houses in both St. Paul and Minneapolis. Of course, at the time, St. Paul was bigger than Minneapolis, so the opera house was bigger in St. Paul. Scott is fascinating. He lived just a few blocks away from where the various Fitzgerald residences were in St. Paul up on Summit Hill. Scott, interestingly, also was quite well known in the performing world because he and 3 other colleagues created really the first national booking system for performers. And you have to remember at this time that opera houses really were just simply big performing theaters. They weren't really just for opera. And so there was an overlap between the performers in the circus world and the opera house world. So it's that connection makes it a little more logical that John Ringling would have invited Lewis Scott out west to see his potential new western base for the circus. What's fascinating here is at the time, John Ringling had a chauffeur who Lewis Scott got attached to, and the chauffeur was Taylor Gordon. Taylor was the youngest son of in the only Black family in White Sulphur Spring, and he was John Ringling chauffeur. Again, at this time, cars were difficult to maintain, so a chauffeur not only drove you around, but maintained the vehicles. Taylor Gordon wanted to be a performer and see the world, so Lewis Scott convinced him to come to St. Paul and be his chauffeur. And we know at the time, this would have been around 1910, we know at the time that Taylor Gordon would have been the only Black chauffeur in St. Paul on Summit Hill. So we have no idea if Fitzgerald and Fitzgerald's family saw Taylor Gordon, knew Taylor Gordon, but in terms of Lewis Scott being chauffeured around St. Paul for a number of years, Taylor Gordon would have perhaps stood out as the only Black chauffeur in the neighborhood. Excuse me. The Taylor Gordon story is even more fascinating in that largely through Ringling connections, Taylor Gordon then left St. Paul and went to New York, where he combined particularly with J. Rosamond Johnson, and you see a playbill for the two of them. They were a duet, and they were known for singing Negro spirituals. They were a quite well-known act. They actually traveled Europe, performed for heads of state and royalty. They were quite famous on the circuit. And those of you who know a little bit about Black history would also recognize the name J. Rosamond Johnson, because he and his brother, James Weldon Johnson, created some of the books of major Negro spirituals, and also created the Black national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And so there's this strong connection between the Johnsons and Taylor Gordon to the Harlem Renaissance, which was flowering at the time in New York City. So there's connects back to Fitzgerald here again in a fascinating sort of way. Again, Taylor Gordon and Fitzgerald would not have connected in White Sulphur Springs, even though they have this connection. They may have seen each other in St. Paul, but then in New York, Taylor Gordon became connected with Carl Van Vechten. And Van Vechten at the time was the dance critic, the first dance critic in America for, I believe, the New York Times, and really was one of the major white promoters of the Harlem Renaissance. Taylor Gordon and Van Vechten became very good friends, and Taylor Gordon was known for a number of years of performing at Van Vechten's parties, but also helping Van Vechten round up other performers. And of course, Van Vechten, who was another Midwesterner, was good friends with Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. There's no question that Scott and Zelda attended a number of Van Vechten parties. So again, no evidence that Taylor Gordon and Fitzgerald connected at these parties, but of the three locations where they overlap, probably most likely that they connected in New York at Van Vechten's parties. Later on, Taylor Gordon wrote a book, Born to Be, highly recommend it, and Van Vechten actually wrote the introduction to the book. So some fascinating, again, tangential connections, but out of these Montana connections, we look at connections to the Harlem Renaissance and performance and the world of Carl Van Vechten, who is a fascinating character connected to Fitzgerald in his own right. And I could go on about that, but I think that's enough to maybe tweak your interest about all of these connections. So I want to finish with kind of recapping a couple of things. One is, I think there's no question that Fitzgerald's visit to Montana was an inspiration for Diamond as Big as the Ritz. There are too many details that are directly related to the story and to his visit. And I think the aspect of Diamond City in my mind is that there was no connection. I mean, no doubt that there was a connection between Fitzgerald having heard the stories around Diamond City and the creation and the use of his imagination to create this great story. Beyond that, there are all these interesting connections, Van Vechten, Taylor Gordon, Lewis Scott, even the connection to Diamond City, are fascinating and intriguing and help illuminate the world of Fitzgerald. But there's also more research to do. I've sort of touched on the broad aspects of these connections, but I think in many cases they're speculative and more digging into archives, newspaper archives, other archives like Lewis Scott's papers are at the University of Minnesota, I believe, could really help illuminate some of the aspects of this story and the early world of Fitzgerald and his visit to Montana. So I hope that intrigues you and makes you look at the story maybe perhaps with a little different historical eye. So I do have a list of major references here, and also want to thank some places for photo credits. Happy to share any of those references or any other aspects with you. Really would love to hear from you on reactions or any other connections that you might have to Montana, and also share the PowerPoint or references or other connections with any of you who may have an interest. So thanks so much for listening today, and I appreciate your tuning in. Enjoy Diamond as Big as the Ritz, and come and visit Montana one of these days. Thanks again. Bye.